Hello, Magic players and collectors. Welcome back to the Land Library. I'm your librarian, and today we're discussing the iconic lands of Mirrodin. Unlike Rabaya in the last episode, Mirrodin has had multiple sets, with even some cards from the plane from outside of its sets, and has also been pretty plot relevant. So this video is going to be a bit longer than the last one. Before getting into the landmarks, though, I think we should go over some of the history of the plane. Mirrodin is an artificial plane created by the planeswalker Karn sometime around 4300 AR. I don't know the exact time, but it's approximately then. And actually, it was created under the name Argentum as a metallic plane of mathematical perfection. Karn resided there for many years with several Urgolems that he created to help maintain the plane, and he sent back some probes to Dominaria, his original plane, to keep an eye on the ongoings of Dominaria. Notably, one of the probes, the one in Cabal, had a flaw in it that made it function completely differently from intended, and more or less granted wishes at the demise of the wielder, and caused intense obsession and madness. It was dubbed the Mirari and kept as a powerful artifact in the Cabal coffers, but eventually, around 4400 AR, Karn came back to collect his defective probe and took it back to Argentum, where he recrafted it into the Ur-Golem that watched over his castle, thus creating a sentient golem named Memnarch. Memnarch was given the authority to rule over Argentum while Karn traveled the multiverse with his friend Jeska. Memnarch kinda just wandered around Argentum aimlessly for quite a while before discovering blink moths, which had somehow appeared on the plane. It's unclear how the blink moths got there, but Memnarch was very fascinated by the biological life, and enlisting the help of the other Ur-Golems, started terraforming Argentum to support life. And then he renamed the plane Mirrodin. Unfortunately, just like the effects it had as an artifact on Dominaria, Memnarch was driven mad by the Mirari, and once the world was finished being terraformed, he destroyed every other Ur-Golem on Mirrodin, and started abducting various life forms from other planes to populate Mirrodin. As his madness and obsession grew, he started experimenting on the inhabitants of Mirrodin, even finding a Mirrodin-born planeswalker named Glissa and trying to capture her to steal her planeswalker spark. Obviously, resistance grew, and eventually led to a 5-year-long war that ended in Memnarch's death. While Memnarch was in control, he had inadvertently, unknowingly, set up a veil that had kept Karn out of the plane. He couldn't come back, but with Memnarch no longer in control, Karn was able to return, and when he did, he sent the inhabitants back to their home planes. But as it had been over 100 years since the first abduction started happening, generations had passed, with many having been born on Mirrodin at this point, and didn't have a plane to go back to. Thus, quite a few were left behind, and these left behind dubbed the event the Vanishing. Little did they know that deep below the surface, Memnarch's experimental subjects still lurked too, having been turned into new Phyrexians with glistening oil. Karn left again to help seal the time rifts on Dominaria, but in doing so, the new Phyrexians rose up in his absence and took over Mirrodin, changing its name once again to New Phyrexia. But there will be much more on that in part 2 of this video. Now, getting into the landmarks, I will be covering just Mirrodin, since Argentum was very empty and basically has no cards, and New Phyrexia will be getting a part 2 to this video. So there are 7 main regions of Mirrodin: the Glimmervoid, the Tangle, the Razor Fields, the Oxida Chain, the Quicksilver Sea, Mephidros, and the Core. Starting with the Glimmervoid, interestingly, this region itself has a land card, but we'll get into the cards a little later. First is lore. The Glimmervoid is perhaps the largest region of Mirrodin, but it's just a vast, empty area of gently rolling hills resembling sand dunes, but made of metal. It's more or less the last remnant of Argentum because it kinda just wasn't terraformed, but it's not completely empty. There are still a few landmarks here, such as the Glimmer Post. Glimmer Post is a locus, and although there are several locuses, each is a unique place, so this is, in fact, a landmark. But what is a locus, you might be asking? Well, the locuses are outposts that Memnarch built all around Mirrodin to go to and observe and experiment on the local life. Although, I'm not really sure what he was trying to observe out in the Glimmer Void, seeing as how there's nothing living out there. But, he still built one in, I believe, every region, but we only have cards for a couple. And although they are not lands, I do think I should mention the only other structures in the Glimmer Void, the Golem Towers. There are 4 towers scattered across the Glimmer Void, built by the Ur-Golems before their demise. They are covered in the long-forgotten Ur-Golem text, each giving a piece of a message which, when read together, gives a warning to readers about Memnarch. There also are an unknown amount of, watchtowers, but these I don't think are landmarks. Now, for the cards themselves, there's obviously Glimmer Void and there's Glimmer Post. For our landmarks, along with the 4 towers, Contested War Zone, Detection Tower, which are the non-landmark towers, and Glimmer Void Basin for related cards. Glimmer Void is a decently good land, making any color mana, but being sacrificed if you control no artifacts, which is pretty easy to get around, especially in artifact-based decks, so it's a pretty minor drawback, making this a common pick in artifact decks, and even sometimes played outside of them. And Glimmer Post is pretty useless, not because its effect is bad, but because there are just so few locust lands for it to actually target. Well, I guess it doesn't target. Its effect is based on number of them. Its only partner for a long time has been Cloudpost, and now there is a third locus from Modern Horizons 3, which is Trenchpost, but since Cloudpost is banned in Modern, these mostly just see play in Commander, where you only get 1 copy of each, so unless you're running a deck that's specifically meant to do goofy locust shenanigans, it barely does anything. Next up, the Tangle. The Tangle is a massive forest, or at least something that resembles a forest, since there aren't actually any trees here, just huge twisted pieces of copper covered in verdigris and mold, giving the illusion of trees. However, there are other, smaller plants that are actually plants. Regardless, its functionality is the same thing as a real forest, and is home to many mutated beasts and forest folk alike, like elves, trolls, and even some humans. Actually, there's humans in every region. It seems to be the only race of anything that's in every region, except the Glimmer Void, I guess. There's 2 big notable landmarks in the Tangle, but only one is a land. Starting with the land, we have the Tree of Tales. This is the largest, quote, tree in the Tangle, and is covered with writing etched into its surface recording all of the history of Mirrodin. But it's not just a big historical textbook in the shape of a tree, it also is hollow inside, and due to its sheer size, it contains the troll city, Tel Jalad, which was considered sacred by both the trolls and the elves, but only a select few elves were ever actually allowed to enter. But after the Vanishing took almost all of the trolls off of Mirrodin, the elves too abandoned Tel Jalad, thinking that it was a bit of a bad omen to stay there. The other landmark doesn't actually have a land card, but is still so important I have to bring it up. The second Tangle landmark is the Uranius Altar, an area in the heart of the Tangle where the Green Lacuna is. One thing I did mention in the general history is that Mirrodin has 5 suns, one in each color of mana, that emerge from the core through tunnels called the Lacunae. However, for a long time there was only 4 suns. For some reason, the green sun, and only the green sun, stopped on the surface, a small green ball, which was dubbed the Radix, and was sacred ground to the elves and humans. This is also where the elves would bring their dead to send them to the afterlife, because any organic matter left here would completely disappear in a matter of days, which also means that this area was completely devoid of mold. For a long time, that's all the Radix was. But during a fight where Glissa tapped into Mirrodin's mana to destroy the Cauldra champion, that tapping into the mana caused a huge amount of green mana to shoot through the Lacuna and turn the Radix into the 5th sun. With the Radix gone, the humans built the altar around the hole left behind. Now for cards, since the Arenas Altar has no cards, the only landmark card is the Tree of Tales. This land is very simple, has the artifact card type along with its land card type, and taps for a green mana. You'll be seeing a lot of this cycle, and these are pretty decent lands that more or less act as basics in artifact-based decks. They aren't actually basics, but being artifacts makes them just as, if not even more, interactable than basics, just without the unlimited number in a deck that actual basics get. And I'll include Pulse of the Radix, Beacon of Creation, and Green Sun's Zenith as related cards. Moving on to the Razor Fields, this is of course the white attuned region, and is named after the small sharp metallic rods sticking out of the ground everywhere that look more or less like grass. There's only really one landmark, which is the Ancient Den. The Ancient Den is the Leonin capital, and the first den built in the fields. The dens are basically just cities, but as the Leonin are lion people, they call them dens. And at the base of the Ancient Den is the place the Leonin call the Cave of Light, which is actually just the White Lacuna. And that's actually kind of it. There's not really any notable events that happen here. So, moving on to the cards, there's just Ancient Den, which is the white artifact land in the cycle, and Beacon of Immortality as a related card, because that's like the white Lacuna. There's also a land called Razorgrass Field, which seems to be a generic field in the region and not a card of the region, especially considering its name is similar but not the same. So it's definitely in this region, but I don't think it's a landmark. I will also mention that Power Depot is possibly in the fields as well. It appears to have some razor grass around it, but it might just be spikes, and I couldn't really find any lore for it, so it can't really be a landmark either way. I can't necessarily say there's only one power depot. So, traveling over to the next region, the Oxida Chain. This is the red region and gets its mountainous appearance by the area all being rusted iron. This region is populated by pretty typical red-aligned races like goblins and barbarian humans who mostly work with the naturally occurring molten metals in the region to craft tools and equipment to trade for resources from other regions. Once again, this region only really has one landmark, which is the Great Furnace. The Great Furnace was built into a massive mountain with a matchingly massive molten metal wellspring at its base. And while not the only forge like this, it is the biggest one. But unlike the last two regions' big landmarks, this is not a city. The immense heat from all the molten metals and constant forging makes this completely unlivable, and non-natives struggle to even go inside. So none of the trading happens here either. It's simply a giant place of work. And that's it. Even the Red Lacuna isn't a landmark, because unlike in the Tangle and the Razor Fields, where the Lacunae were revered and sacred, the people in the Oxida chain don't give a rat's ass about their Lacuna, and never even bothered finding it. Or even if they did find it, they sure didn't bother remembering where it was. So for cards, it's just Great Furnace, which is the red artifact land, then Furnace Celebration and Beacon of Destruction, which are inside the Great Furnace, and the first beacon that's not a Lacunae, and actually the only one that's not a Lacunae, as our related cards. Now on to the Quicksilver Sea. This is obviously the main blue region, and could actually be considered kind of a real sea, instead of just something resembling a sea, because it is still an actual huge body of liquid. It's just that the liquid isn't water, it's a liquid metal. It doesn't seem to be a real metal like mercury, and is definitely safe to the touch, but probably not drinkable. The sea has many huge spires poking through, which is where the residents of the region actually live, which is mostly Vidalcan, but there are also humans that live on the shore and travel between the Vidalcan settlements and the mainland to trade and work as laborers. But the Vidalcan are the main scientists and inventors of the plane. So the first landmark is Lumengrid, also known as Seat of the Synod, the Vidalcan capital, and of course, largest spire. It gets its nickname, Seat of the Synod, because the Synod is the name for the council of the highest level of Vidalcan rulers and officials, and reasonably, they would reside in the capital. Also, inside Lumengrid was, unsurprisingly, the Blue Lacuna, but the Vidalcan added a platform above the Lacuna that they called the Pool of Knowledge, where they go to receive revelations by drinking Blinkmoth serum and basically tripping out. But Lumengrid is not the only one. There is also the Titan Forge. This, although not a land card, is an odd part of the sea where the liquid just stops, and the seafloor is exposed in a large circle. This odd feature of the sea was then used to craft a gigantic forge for colossi, which are basically just really, really big golems. But that means there is still just one landmark card, which is Seed of the Synod, the blue artifact land. But it does also have a plain card for the region, which is, of course, Quicksilver Sea, and throw Knowledge Pool, Beacon of Tomorrows, and Titan Forge into related cards. And I think you know what's coming next. It's Mephidros, which is, surprise, surprise, the main black region, and actually this time is a big toxic swamp instead of metal that looks like one. The region is covered in actual water, but that water is full of like scum, toxins, and corrosion, so it's gross water. There are also many odd tube-like structures that dot the landscape known as the chimneys. The chimneys can drastically vary in size, but all of them blow out toxic gas called necrogen, and produce a constant mechanical hum from somewhere underground. But nobody knows what exactly is producing the sounds and the gas. There isn't even necessarily a connection between them, but there probably is. And necrogen is some pretty serious stuff that will drive people mad and increase tendencies like greed, hate, and violence, while it slowly saps out the life of living creatures, turning them into zombies that then start to produce the gas themselves. This is a very difficult place to live, especially for very long, so there are very few scattered populations in the region, but there is the Vault of Whispers. Also known as Ish-Sa, this was a stronghold built on top of the Black Lacuna, where the powerful Lich Geth controlled the zombies to rule the region from. Geth was very influential in the fight against Memnarch, but was also quite ambitious, encroaching the Mephidros' borders pretty deep into the Razor Fields and the Tangle, making it the dominant biome for a while before the Phyrexian invasion. And that's all there is to say right now. So, on to the cards, which is, once again, just one, Vault of Whispers, the Black Artifact Land, but let's add in Necrogen Mists, Geth, Lord of the Vault, Throne of Geth, and Beacon of Unrest as our related cards. Now, on to our final region, the Core. This is the only region not on the surface, and is unsurprisingly a massive spherical space at the center of Mirrodin, and at its center is a huge ball of pure mana. The Mana Core is the source of the 5 suns, and ejected them all during the early history of the plane. This ejection also is what created the Lacuna, which are the only way in or out of the core. Memnarch found his way in and set up his stronghold/base of operations, the Darksteel Citadel, here in the core. From the Darksteel Citadel, Memnarch controlled the Mana Core, using it as a power source for his constructs, forming armies of them to control the surface. But also in the core was the Mycosynth Towers, which were a result of Karn's glistening oil taking hold in the core. Memnarch used the Mycosynth to experiment on kidnapped Mirrodins, transforming them into the first handful of new Phyrexians. But eventually, when Memnarch was defeated by Glissa, the new Phyrexians were left behind in the core by themselves. These leftover new Phyrexians turned Glissa's corpse into a Phyrexian zombie and started gathering forces for their eventual invasion. The rest of this story will be coming in part 2, so it is card time instead. This time, there's 2 landmarks, Mirrodin's Core and Darksteel Citadel. Darksteel Citadel is incredibly simple. It is an artifact land, surprise, surprise, but this one has indestructible and taps for colorless. It's mostly just played in artifact decks because it's an indestructible artifact, but it doesn't really do a whole lot else. And Mirrodin's Core can also tap for a colorless, tap to add a charge counter, or tap to use a charge counter to make any color of mana. This is another niche land, but it goes in proliferate decks. That counter can be proliferated for bonus mana of any color, which is pretty nice, but without being able to get those extra counters, it kind of just gets one colored mana every other turn, or colorless mana every turn, which isn't really good enough to run most times, so it kind of is just in proliferate decks. And finally, for related cards, there is the plain card. I'm probably not going to pronounce this right, but Panopticon, and the Mycosynth Lattice. Now, as a final note, I want to cover some regionless lands. First off, Cloudpost / Trenchpost. This is another locus, and was, of course, in the clouds, meant to observe flying creatures like the Blinkmoths and Terrans. And I can't quite confirm for sure, but I believe it was the first locus built because of Memnarch's fascination with the Blinkmoths. But after Memnarch's death, there was nobody there to maintain it anymore, and it fell from the clouds, turning into Trenchpost. Trenchpost, has basically just never been used for anything. It's just an old, forgotten locus, and it fell into an unknown area, but the art does look a bit like, well, let's just say a new Phyrexian region for now, and I'll talk about it more in that video. Then let's talk about the borders. There are lands for each area in between the colored regions where they meet, and although cool, these are much too general to include as actual landmarks. However, each of these border regions have a bridge which could possibly be landmarks, but other than the cards themselves, I have no info about them, so it's hard to tell if these are actual unique places or if there's like many bridges in each of the border regions. And that's it. That's all the major landmark lands and a few extra mentioned cards of Mirrodin. But this plane still has many more stories to tell, just not today. If you've made it this far in the video, drop a like for a turn and subscribe for more land-filled content. If I missed anything, got anything wrong, or you just have questions, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next local landmarks, which will be part 2 of this plane, New Phyrexia, and will be a pretty short wait. I'm kind of just going to do a bunch of the Edge of Eternity stuff, because that's coming out very soon, and then I will get back to part 2.